The Discourses of Christ of the Last Days.
Only by resolving one's notions can one embark on the right track of belief in God. 1. What other notions are there within your hearts that can influence the performance of your duties? What notions often influence and govern you in your lives? When certain things happen to you that are not to your liking, your notions naturally appear, and then you complain to God, argue and compete with God, and they bring about a rapid transformation in your relationship with God. You go from how you were at the beginning, feeling that you love God so much and that you are very loyal to Him and wanting to devote your whole life to Him, to suddenly having a change of heart, to not wanting to perform your duty or be loyal to God anymore, and you regret your belief in God. You regret having chosen this path, and even complain about being chosen by God. What other notions are able to suddenly cause a change in your relationship with God?
When God arranges a situation to test me and reveals me, and I feel that I won't have a good outcome, I form notions about God. I feel that I believe in God and follow God, and that I've always done my duty. So as long as I do not forsake God, then He shouldn't abandon me.
That is one kind of notion. Do you often have such notions? What is your understanding of being abandoned by God? Do you think that if God leaves you, then that means God does not want you and will not save you? This is another kind of notion. So how does such a notion come about? Does it come from your imagination, or does it have a basis? How do you know that God won't give you a good outcome? Did God tell you personally? Such thoughts are entirely delineated by you. Now you know that this is a notion. The key question is how to solve it. People actually have many notions about faith in God. If you can realize that you have a notion, then you should know that it's wrong. So, how should these notions be resolved? First, you need to see clearly whether these notions come from knowledge or satanic philosophies, where the fault lies, where the harm lies, and once you've seen this clearly, you'll naturally be able to let the notion go. However, this is not the same as you thoroughly resolving it. You must still seek the truth. See what God's requirements are, and then dissect the notion according to God's words. When you can clearly discern that the notion is wrong, that it is something absurd, and that it is totally out of line with the truth, that means that you have basically resolved the notion. If you don't seek the truth, if you don't compare the notion with God's words, you won't be able to clearly discern how the notion is wrong, and so you won't be able to thoroughly give the notion up. Even if you know it is a notion, you still won't necessarily be able to let it go completely. In such circumstances, when your notions conflict with God's requirements, and even though you may realize that your notions are wrong, yet your heart still clings to your notions, and you know for sure that your notions are at odds with the truth, yet in your heart you still believe that your notions are tenable. You will then not be someone who understands the truth, and people like you have no life entry and are too lacking in stature. For instance, People are especially sensitive toward their own outcome and destination, and toward adjustments of their duty and being replaced in their duty. Some people frequently jump to an erroneous conclusion about such things, thinking that as soon as they are replaced in their duty and they have no status anymore, or God says He does not like or want them anymore, then it is over for them. This is the conclusion they come to. They believe, there's no point in believing in God, God doesn't want me, and my outcome is already set, so what's the point in living anymore? Others, hearing such thoughts, think them reasonable and dignified. But what kind of thinking is this, actually? It is rebelliousness against God. It is abandoning themselves to despair. Why do they abandon themselves to despair? It is because they don't understand God's will. They can't clearly see how God saves people, and they don't have true faith in God. Does God know when people abandon themselves to despair? God knows. And so how does He treat such people? People form a kind of notion and say, God has paid such a painstaking price for man. He has done much work in every person and exerted much effort. It is not easy for God to choose and save a person. God will be so hurt if a person abandons themselves to despair, and will hope each day that they can pick themselves up. This is the meaning on a superficial level, but in fact, it is also a notion of man. God takes a certain attitude toward such people. If you abandon yourself to despair and do not try to move forward, He will allow you to choose for yourself. He will not force you to do anything against your will. If you say, I still wish to perform the duty of a created being, to do all I can to practice as God asks, and to satisfy the will of God. I will use all my gifts and talents, and if I'm not capable of anything, then I'll learn to submit and be obedient. I will not abandon my duty. God says, if you are willing to live in this way, then continue following, but you must do as God asks. The standards required by God and His principles do not change. What do these words mean? They mean that only people can abandon themselves. God would never abandon someone. For anyone who is able to ultimately attain salvation and behold God, who establishes a normal relationship with God, and who can come before God, this is not something that can be achieved after failing or being pruned a single time, or after being judged and chastised a single time. Before Peter was made perfect, he was refined hundreds of times. Of those who remain after laboring to the very end, there will not be one who has only experienced trials and refinement 8 or 10 times before making it to the end. Regardless of how many times someone is tested and refined, is this not the love of God? When you can behold the love of God, you can then understand God's attitude toward man. When some people read God's words and see God condemning people in His words, they form notions and feel conflicted. For example, God's words say that you don't accept the truth, so God doesn't like you or accept you, that you are an evildoer, an antichrist, that He gets upset just looking at you, and that He doesn't want you. People read these words and think, these words are aimed at me. God has determined that He doesn't want me, and since God has abandoned me, I won't believe in God anymore either. There are those who, when reading God's words, often develop notions and misunderstandings, because God exposes people's corrupt states and says some things condemning people. They become negative and weak, thinking that God's words were directed at them, that God is giving up on them and won't save them. They become negative to the point of tears and don't want to follow God anymore. This is actually a misunderstanding of God. When you do not understand the meaning of God's words, you should not try to delineate God. You don't know what kind of person God abandons, or under what circumstances He gives up on people, or under what circumstances He puts people aside. There are principles and contexts to all of this. If you don't have full insight into these detailed matters, you'll be very prone to hypersensitivity, and you'll delimit yourself based on one word from God. Isn't that problematic? When God judges people, what is the chief aspect of them that He condemns? What God judges and exposes are people's corrupt dispositions and corrupt essences. He condemns their satanic dispositions and satanic natures. He condemns the various manifestations and behaviors of their rebellion and opposition to God. He condemns them for being unable to submit to God, for always opposing God, and for always having their own motivations and aims. But such condemnation does not mean that God has abandoned people with satanic dispositions. If this is not clear to you, then you lack comprehension ability, which makes you a bit like people who are mentally ill, always suspicious of everything and misinterpreting God. Such people are devoid of true faith. So how could they follow God to the very end? Hearing a single statement of condemnation from God, you think that, having been condemned by God, people have been abandoned by God and will no longer be saved. And because of this, you become negative and abandon yourself to despair. This is misinterpreting God. In fact, God has not abandoned people. They have misinterpreted God and abandoned themselves. Nothing is more critical than when people abandon themselves, as fulfilled in the words of the Old Testament. Fools die for want of wisdom. No behavior is more stupid than when people abandon themselves to despair. Sometimes you read God's words that seem to delineate people. In fact, they are not delineating anyone, but are the expression of God's will and opinion. These are words of truth and principle. They are not delineating anyone. The words uttered by God during times of anger or rage also represent God's disposition. These words are the truth, and moreover, belong to principle. People must understand this. God's purpose in saying this is to allow people to understand the truth and to understand the principles. It is absolutely not to delimit anyone. This has nothing to do with people's ultimate destination and reward. Much less are they people's ultimate punishment. These are merely words spoken to judge and prune people. They are the result of anger at people not living up to His expectations, and they are spoken in order to wake people up, to prompt them, and they are words from God's heart. And yet some people fall down and forsake God because of a single statement of judgment from God. People like this don't know what's good for them. They are impervious to reason. They do not accept the truth at all. Some people feel weak for a time and then come before God again, thinking, "This isn't right. I must continue to follow God and do as God requires. If I don't follow God or perform my duty well, then my life will be worthless. For the sake of living out a meaningful life, I must follow God." So, how do they follow God? They must experience God's work. Only saying one believes in God and not experiencing God's work is not following God. Previously not loyally performing one's duty and being unwilling to accept a little pruning. Is this the attitude one should have when accepting God's work? Not accepting being pruned and constantly complaining when one suffers a little. What kind of disposition is this? One should reflect on oneself and see what God requires, and one must do as God requires. If God says you're not good enough, then you're not good enough, and you shouldn't use your notions and imaginings to delimit things or oppose God. You should submit and acknowledge that you are not good enough. Don't you then have a path of practice? Can someone still leave God when they're able to practice the truth and submit to God? No, they can't. There are times when you believe God has given up on you. But in fact, God has not given up on you. He just puts you to one side so that you can reflect on yourself. God may find you detestable and does not wish to heed you, but He has not truly forsaken you. There are those who make an effort to perform their duty in the house of God, but because of their essence and the various things that are manifested in them, God sees that they do not love the truth and do not accept the truth at all, and so God actually forsakes them. They were not truly chosen, but merely rendered service for a time. There are some, meanwhile, whom God does His utmost to discipline, chasten, and judge, and even condemn and curse, employing various ways of treating them that are at odds with the notions of man. Some people do not understand God's will and think that God is picking on them and being hurtful. They think that there is no dignity to living before God. They do not wish to hurt God any longer and leave the church. They even think that acting like this has reason, and in this way they turn their backs on God. But in fact, God had not forsaken them. Such people have no inkling of the will of God. They are somewhat oversensitive, going so far as to give up on God's salvation. Do they really have conscience? There are times when God shuns people, and times when He places them to one side for a time so that they may reflect upon themselves. But God has not forsaken them. He is giving them the opportunity to repent. God only truly forsakes evil people who commit many evil acts, non-believers, and antichrists. Some people say, "I feel devoid of the work of the Holy Spirit, and long have I been without the enlightenment of the Holy Spirit. Has God forsaken me?" This is a misconception. There is also a problem of disposition here. People are over-emotional. They always follow their own reasoning, are always willful, and are devoid of rationality. Isn't this a problem of disposition? You say that God has forsaken you, that He will not save you. So has He set your outcome? God has merely said a few angry words to you? How could you say that He's given up on you, that He doesn't want you anymore? There are occasions when you cannot feel the work of the Holy Spirit, but God has not deprived you of the right to read His words, nor has He determined your outcome or cut off your path to salvation. So what are you so upset about? You are in a bad state. There is a problem with your motives. There are issues with your thought and viewpoint. Your state of mind is twisted. And yet, you do not try to fix these things by seeking the truth. Instead, constantly misinterpreting and complaining about God, and pushing the responsibility onto God, and even saying, "God doesn't want me, so I don't believe in Him anymore." Are you not being irrational? Are you not being unreasonable? This kind of person is too over-emotional, without any sense at all, impervious to all reason. They are the least likely to accept the truth and will find it very difficult to attain salvation. Remember these words. Peter was made perfect by being refined hundreds of times. In your notions and imaginings, being refined hundreds of times is to live a spectacular life of untold hardships to follow God, and in the end, to be crucified upside down. This isn't the case. This is just man's notion. Why do I say this is man's notion? It's because people don't understand what God's trials are, and that every trial is arranged and done by the hand of God. People don't understand this hundreds of times, or why God refined Peter hundreds of times, or how this hundreds of times was reached, or what the root cause was. People don't know these things, instead always relying on their notions and imaginings to understand things, and as a result, they misunderstand God. People are unable to understand certain words of God which they have not experienced. In real life, if what God does with every person is to bless them, guide them, and speak calmly to them, then trials would forever be just empty words for people, and nothing more than a word, a definition, a concept. However, God often performs this work on you, now causing you to become sick, now causing you to encounter something unpleasant and become discouraged and weak, now causing you to encounter a difficult situation that you find hard to cope with and you don't know the right thing to do. What are these things to you? When it comes to all these unpleasant things, all these sicknesses or difficulties or hardships, and even the temptations of Satan, if you can always regard them as trials given to you by God, each one being one trial among hundreds, and you can accept them and seek the truth within them, then your state will undergo a transformation and your relationship with God will improve. However, if when you encounter trials you reject them, constantly try to hide from them, resist them, and oppose them, then this hundreds of trials will forever be just empty words to you which will never be fulfilled. For example, someone harbors a bad attitude toward you and, not knowing the reason for this, you feel unhappy. If you live within hot-headedness and within your flesh, then you have an excuse to be unpleasant to them as well. A tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye. But if you live before God and you wish to accept being perfected and saved by God, then you should regard all this you encounter as a trial from God and accept it. In truth, this is one of the different ways in which God tests you. By fellowshipping in this way, do you now feel much more liberated and much more relieved in your hearts? If you can practice in accordance with these words, compare your behavior and views with these words, then this will assist you greatly when it comes to submitting to God's orchestrations and arrangements in your daily lives. What are the main aspects involved in today's discussion of people's notions concerning belief in God? One is the aspect of people's external behavior, acting as falsely as the Pharisees, acting so refined and genteel. Another aspect is that of food, clothing, housing, and travel. Another is the aspect of people's understanding of belief in God, thinking that by believing in God, they must be blessed and given advantages. What was Job's experience of this aspect? When trials befell Job, he was able to ascertain that they came from God, that he hadn't done anything wrong, and that this was not a punishment from God, but rather this was God testing him, and it was Satan tempting him. This was how he understood it. And how did Job's friends understand it? They believed that this calamity must have befallen Job because he'd done something wrong and offended God. That they could think this way shows that they harbored notions about belief in God. Why was Job's understanding different from the others? It was because Job had clearly seen what was happening, and so he harbored no notions about it. While God performed his work on Job, Job gained an experience and came to know God's work. And these notions and ideas of man were no longer to be found in Job. And so, when the hand of God fell upon Job, did he misunderstand?
No.
He didn't misunderstand, and so he didn't complain. He didn't misunderstand, and so he didn't rebel. He didn't misunderstand, and so he was able to truly submit. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Why is it right? If people say amen to God's words in their hearts, take God's words as the reality of positive things, as that which is right, as the standard, as the supreme, and as the principles they should put into practice, then they will submit and not misunderstand. There is always an expression when people form misunderstandings about the words God utters or the deeds God does. What expression is that?
They're unwilling to accept them.
And what lies behind this unwillingness to accept God's words and deeds? It is that they have their own ideas, and these ideas contradict and clash with God's words. And then people form misunderstandings and notions about God, believing that the things God says aren't necessarily correct. Sometimes, even if people appear to accept them, it's still just a pretense and is not true acceptance. One must, by seeking the truth, think completely in accordance with God's words and requirements, and agree with God's words in one's heart, and only then can one be compatible with God. If you don't accept these things in your heart, and you misunderstand and even oppose and resist them, then this shows that there is something inside you. If you can dissect this thing inside you and seek the truth, then your notions can be resolved. If you have a distorted understanding, if you have no spiritual understanding, or you have no comprehension ability, you simply aren't capable of comparing your notions to God's words, are unable to know and dissect them, and you're not aware when notions arise in you, then your notions will be unresolvable. Some people know perfectly well that they harbor notions about God in their hearts, yet they still say they have none, afraid that if they speak up, then they'll lose face and be looked down on. If someone asks them, "If you haven't misunderstood God, how come you can't submit to Him?" Then they reply, "I don't know how to practice." What kind of manifestation is this? If you have no spiritual understanding, if you're not capable of discernment, and don't know how to reflect on yourself when you have a problem, then you won't be able to resolve your notions or your misunderstandings about God. When things happen which aren't related to your notions, you feel very calm, and it can't be seen that you have any problem. The moment something happens that touches upon your notions, however, feelings of conflict to God arise in you. How is this conflict manifested? Sometimes you may feel resentful, and as time goes by and this feeling is not resolved, then your misunderstandings about God become even more entrenched and your corrupt disposition swells, and you will begin to vent your notions and judge God. The moment you judge God, then it is no longer a problem of thinking or behavior, but rather is a revelation of a satanic disposition. If someone shows a little conflict or lacks submission in their behavior out of sheer ignorance, then God does not condemn this. If someone directly conflicts with God from their disposition and conflicts with Him on purpose, then this will cause trouble for them, and they are defying God. When someone defies God on purpose, then this is an offense against God's disposition. Therefore, when people have notions, they should resolve them. Only when they've resolved their notions can they resolve the misunderstandings between themselves and God. And only when the misunderstandings between themselves and God are resolved can they truly submit to God. Some people say, "I have no notions, and the misunderstandings between myself and God have been resolved. I don't think of anything anymore." Is this enough? The purpose of resolving notions is not only to resolve notions, but rather it is to practice in accordance with God's requirements and the truth, to achieve submission to God and satisfy God. Some people say, "So long as I have no misunderstandings about God, then that's enough. Everything will be fine, and I'll be safe." This is not truly putting the truth into practice, nor is it true submission. The problem has still not been resolved. If the problem really was resolved, then not only would people have no misunderstandings about God, but they would also know what God requires and what His will is in the things that happen to them. They would not only be able to dissect their own notions, but would also be able to help those with notions to learn how to seek the truth, to be able to practice the truth and to meet God's requirements. Wouldn't they then be in accord with God's will? The ultimate goal in resolving notions is to understand God's will and to enter the truth reality. This is key. You say you have not formed any misunderstandings about God. So do you understand the truth? if you do not understand the truth, then even if you have no notions or misunderstandings about God, you're still not someone who submits to God. Having no misunderstandings does not mean that you understand God. Much less does it mean that you are capable of submitting to Him. People have no notions or misunderstandings about God when all is well, but this doesn't mean that they have no notions or misunderstandings about God at all. When something happens to them which touches upon their personal interests, their notions then naturally arise, and they will form misunderstandings about God and even voice complaints. Can people submit to God when they regard their personal interests as so very important? Why is it that when something happens that affects someone's personal interests, their notions and misunderstandings arise in its wake, and they rebel against and defy God? This is how it is with people who have a satanic nature and satanic disposition. When something happens that affects their personal interests, they aren't able to submit to God anymore. And neither can they submit to God when something happens that is at odds with their own notions and imaginings. People's notions and misunderstandings about God arise with their situation. If they're not able to seek and accept the truth, then their notions will never be resolved, and their relationship with God will never return to normal. Those who harbor notions but do not seek the truth to resolve them will not be saved by God, no matter how many years they have believed in Him. God's salvation of man is not just empty words. He expresses all these truths in order to address the various things of corrupt mankind that are at odds with the truth. Their notions, imaginings, knowledge, philosophies, traditional culture, etc. By dissecting these things, He allows man to understand what constitutes positive things, what constitutes negative things, which things come from God, which things come from Satan, what the truth is, and what the philosophies and logic of Satan are. When people are able to see these things for what they really are, they will naturally choose to pursue the correct path of life, and they are able to practice the truth, to do as God asks, and discern negative things. This is what God asks of man, and so, too, is it the standard by which He perfects and saves people. Some people say, God dissects man's notions, but I have no notions. People who have notions are usually wily old foxes, or else theologians and Pharisees. I'm not like that. What is the problem in being able to say such a thing? They do not know themselves. No matter how the truth is fellowshipped, they don't apply it to themselves, thinking that they are not like that. This is ignorance, and they have no spiritual understanding. Could you think in this way? Today, most people do not think like that. When one has eaten and drunk many of God's words and can understand some truths, one is then able to see clearly that everyone possesses the things of notions and imaginings, and that everyone possesses corrupt dispositions. There is nothing shameful in dissecting these things. After dissecting them, furthermore, they believe that it will help others develop discernment, and they themselves will grow and be able to understand the truth more quickly. For this reason, they are all able to openly dissect themselves. What is the aim of dissecting notions? It is to put aside these notions, to address misunderstandings between man and God, and then enable people to focus on what God asks of man, to know how to enter onto the path of salvation, and to know what to do to practice the truth. By often practicing in this way, the intended effect is achieved in the end. One aspect is that people will come to understand the will of God and become able to submit to God, while another aspect is that they will have the immunity to reject and resist many negative things, such as wicked notions and imaginings, and things that arise from knowledge. When faced with a religious intellectual, a theologian, or a religious pastor or elder, you can see through them by talking with them, and are able to use the truth to refute their myriad notions, imaginings, heresies, and fallacies. This shows that you are able to identify negative things, that you have understood some truths, that you are possessed of a certain stature, and so are not intimidated when faced with these religious leaders and figures. The knowledge, the learning, and the philosophies they talk about, even all of their ideologies and theories, are untenable. For you have seen through the words and doctrines, the notions and imaginings of religion, and those things can mislead you no longer. But you are not there yet. When you encounter these religious fraudsters and Pharisees, or anyone with a little status, you are intimidated. You know what they are saying is wrong, that it consists of notions and imaginings, born of knowledge, but you do not know how to repudiate it. You do not know from where to start dissecting it, or which words to expose these people with. Does this not show that you still have not understood the truth? So, you must equip yourselves with the truth, and, once you have understood the truth, you can then dissect yourselves, and you will know how to have discernment of people. When you have understood the truth, you will be able to see other people clearly. But if you do not understand the truth, you will never be able to see them clearly. To see through people and things, you must understand the truth. Without the truth as your foundation, as your life, you will not be able to deeply penetrate anything. When people have resolved various notions and imaginings, they have knowledge and experience of God's words, and at the same time, they have also entered the reality of God's words. In the process of entering the reality of God's words, the various notions and imaginings that arise in people are resolved one by one, and there is a change in people's knowledge of God's work, God's essence, and the various attitudes God has toward people. How is this change brought about? It is brought about when people put aside their various notions and the imaginings of man, when they put aside the various ideas and perspectives that come from knowledge, philosophy, traditional culture, or the world, and instead accept the various points of view that come from God and that are connected to the truth. When people accept the words of God as their life, they also enter into the reality of God's words and are able to regard and think about questions using the truth and resolve issues using the truth. Once people have resolved their various notions and misunderstandings about God, they can then immediately improve their relationship with God, while at the same time pave their road toward life entry. When people achieve such changes, what becomes of their relationship with God? it becomes one of created beings and creator. In relationships at this level, there is no competition, no temptation, and very little rebellion. People are much more submissive, understanding, worshipful, loyal, and honest toward God, and they truly fear God. This is the change brought to people's lives when they have resolved their notions. If you are able to achieve this kind of change, are you then willing to resolve your notions? But resolving people's notions is a very painful process. People must deny themselves. They must put aside their notions. Put aside the things they believe to be right. Put aside the things that they persistently seek. Put aside the things they have believed to be correct, and which they have pursued and longed for their whole lives. This means that people must rebel against themselves, must put aside the knowledge, philosophies, even their way of existence that were learned from the world of Satan, and replace them with another way of living, the foundation and the root of which is the truth. As such, people must endure great suffering. Such suffering may not be physical illness or the hardship and difficulties of daily life, but it may come from a change in all types of views of different things and of mankind in your heart. Or it may even come from a change in the various aspects of the knowledge you have of God, which turns upside down your knowledge and view of the world, human life, mankind, and even God. We just now fellowshipped on people's notions concerning belief in God and gave several examples so that you could have a basic concept of this aspect of the truth. Afterward, you may contemplate it again and fellowship on it together, draw inferences, and gradually reflect, understand, and dissect the various notions concerning belief in God, before then resolving them step by step. In short, people have many imaginings and notions about belief in God. For example, whether in terms of people's lives, marriage, family, or work, the moment some difficulty arises, people form notions about God, and then they complain about and judge Him, always thinking in their hearts, "Why doesn't God protect me or bless me?" It's just like what the unbelievers always say: heaven is unfair, and heaven is blind. But these things do not happen by accident. When life is comfortable and happy, people never say one word of thanks to God and can even deny God and doubt His existence. When disaster comes calling, however, they make God responsible for it, and they begin to judge and blaspheme against God. Some people even think that they no longer need to learn anything or work once they believe in God, that God will prepare everything for them when the time comes, and that if they have any difficulty, they can pray to God and entrust the matter to Him, and He'll solve it for them. They believe that if they get sick, God will heal them, that if disaster befalls, God will protect them, that when the day of God arrives, they'll all change form, and that if God performs signs and wonders, everything will be all right. These are imaginings and notions people have. As for the professional knowledge related to duties people should learn it in accordance with what is needed for their duty. This is called pragmatism and dedication to one's proper task, and one should not just dream and rely on one's imagination. What God requires people to do is that which people must do. That is the duties people should perform. This absolutely cannot be changed and must be approached conscientiously. This is in accord with the truth, and it is the perspective people should have toward their duty. This is not a notion. It is the truth, and it is what God requires. There are many times when the things God does are at odds with people's imaginings. If people can set aside their notions, seek God's will, and seek the truth principles, then they will be able to pass through these things. If you are stubborn and you cling obstinately to your notions, then that is tantamount to you not accepting the truth, not accepting things that are right, and not accepting God's requirements. If you don't accept the truth or the things that are right, could you not then be said to be in opposition to God? The truth and positive things come from God. If you don't accept them and instead cling to your notions, then clearly you are opposed to the truth. We'll end our fellowship on people's notions concerning belief in God here. What is left is for you to apply it to yourselves on the basis of these principles and the words we've fellowshipped here today. Notions concerning people's belief in God are the most common and most basic of the three types of notions. The truths related to these notions are not really that profound, and so these notions should be easy to resolve.